The fluorescent lights of Chicago Memorial Hospital hummed their indifferent melody as Rosa Delgado pressed her back against the cold corridor wall, her white uniform trembling like a flag of surrender. Before her stood Margaret Whitmore, designer heels clicking against sterile tiles, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing the air with each venomous word that echoed through the hallway. Nurses hurried past with downcast eyes, their silence more deafening than the accusations poisoning the air between them, while Rosa's heart hammered a desperate rhythm against her ribcage. She had survived poverty in Manila's crowded streets, endured sleepless nights studying by candlelight, and crossed an ocean to heal strangers in a foreign land, but nothing had prepared her for this moment of complete helplessness. The woman's face twisted with rage as she raised her foot in a theatrical gesture of dominance, and Rosa heard herself speak words she never imagined would escape her lips. "Please, ma'am, please don't kick me." The plea tasted like ashes in her mouth, each syllable a betrayal of her dignity that somehow seemed necessary for survival. Rosa's knees buckled slightly as she watched the woman's expensive shoe hover inches from her body, time stretching into a surreal eternity where every breath felt borrowed and conditional. Behind Margaret, her mother lay recovering. In room 412, surrounded by machines and medications that Rosa herself had carefully monitored throughout the night shift, checking vitals with gentle hands that never betrayed her exhaustion. The complaint was absurd. Something about ice water being 2 degrees too warm and medication arriving 5 minutes late, but the fury it unleashed was terrifyingly real. Rosa's mind flashed to her phone in the break room, to the messages from Manila she had not yet answered, to her sister Elena's latest hospital bills waiting in her email inbox with their cruel red numbers. She thought of her nursing license, her work visa, the thin thread upon which her entire family's survival dangled, and felt shame burn through her veins like fever. Margaret's voice rose higher, attracting curious glances from visitors in the waiting area, each witness to Rosa's humiliation, another weight added to the crushing burden she carried. The words kept coming, accusations wrapped in entitlement and delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had never once feared losing everything. Rosa's eyes stung with unshed tears that she refused to release, knowing that crying would only confirm whatever narrative this woman had constructed about incompetent foreign nurses who did not belong in American hospitals. She could smell the coffee from the nurses' station mixing with the antiseptic that defined her daily existence, ordinary scents made strange by the extraordinary nightmare unfolding in this public space. Her hands, which had held dying patients with compassion and administered countless treatments with precision, now trembled uselessly at her sides. Margaret moved closer, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper about lawyers. And deportation, words chosen specifically to wound where Rosa was most vulnerable. The hospital corridor suddenly felt like a courtroom where she had already been judged and sentenced, her defense never requested, her humanity never considered. Then footsteps approached with purpose, confident and unhurried, cutting through the toxic atmosphere. Like a surgical blade through diseased tissue, Rosa barely dared to raise her eyes as a tall figure in navy blue scrubs moved between her and her tormentor, his presence shifting the entire geometry of the confrontation with quiet authority. Dr. Michael Chen's voice carried the kind of calm that preceded storms, measured and clear as he spoke. Words that would change everything. "Step away from my nurse now." The hallway held its breath. Margaret Whitmore's face transformed from righteous anger to indignant shock, her mouth opening and closing like a fish suddenly removed from water as she processed this unexpected interruption to her performance. Dr. Chen did not repeat himself. His dark eyes fixed on her with the kind of unwavering focus he usually reserved for critical surgeries, and something in his stillness communicated more threat than any raised voice could achieve. Rosa felt the air shift, felt oxygen return to her lungs in a sudden grateful rush as the doctor's broad shoulders created a physical barrier between her and the woman who had reduced her to begging moments before. Security materialized, as if summoned by telepathy. Two officers responding to the subtle gesture Dr. Chen made without breaking eye contact with Margaret, their radios crackling softly in the suddenly charged atmosphere. The wealthy woman sputtered protests about knowing board members and calling lawyers. Her designer purse clutched against her chest like a shield of privilege that was rapidly losing its protective power. Within minutes, she was being escorted toward the administrative offices, her expensive heels clicking a retreat that echoed Rosa's racing heartbeat, and the small crowd that had gathered began dispersing with disappointed expressions. The drama concluded without the violent climax they had unconsciously anticipated. But as the security officers disappeared around the corner with their protesting charge, Rosa felt panic flood through her veins with unexpected intensity, replacing relief with a terror that made her legs weak and her vision blur at the edges. She pushed past Dr. Chen with trembling hands, outstretched, her voice cracking as words tumbled out in a desperate cascade she could not control, begging him to bring the woman back, apologizing profusely for any inconvenience caused. "Please, doctor, please, I can handle it. She was just upset about her mother. I should have been more attentive. Please don't let this become a problem." The sentences ran together without proper breath between them, her accent thickening with distress. Dr. Chen turned to face her fully for the first time, and Rosa watched confusion, then something like horror dawn across his features as he truly saw her, not as the victim he had just rescued, but as someone more damaged by survival than by the attack itself. His hand reached out as if to steady her, but she flinched instinctively, and in that involuntary movement, an entire story revealed itself without a single word spoken. The doctor's jaw tightened as he guided her gently toward an empty consultation room, his touch careful and impersonal professional concern replacing the righteous anger that had fueled his intervention in the corridor. Inside the small space, with its generic watercolor prints and outdated medical posters, Rosa felt the walls closing in as Dr. Chen closed the door and turned to face her with questions written clearly across his expression. "How long has this been happening?" His voice was softer now, but no less intense, and Rosa found herself unable to meet his eyes, her gaze fixed on her own hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had turned white against her brown skin. She wanted to lie, wanted to smile, and reassure him that this was an isolated incident, an unfortunate misunderstanding that would blow over like a brief summer storm. But something in his patient waiting made the careful walls she had built around her truth begin to crumble. The words that emerged surprised even her with their honesty, quiet and defeated, carrying months of accumulated weight she had never planned to share with anyone. "Every day," Rosa whispered finally, and in those two syllables, Dr. Michael Chen heard the echo of a suffering he had somehow walked past 100 times without truly seeing, and the knowledge settled on his shoulders like a responsibility he could never again set down. Rosa's apartment existed in a photograph on her phone, but she had not seen it in daylight for 3 months. Her life reduced to an endless cycle of fluorescent corridors and medication carts that blurred together like watercolors left in rain. Dr. Chen listened without interrupting as she explained the mathematics of survival, her voice gaining steadiness as she recited numbers that had become her entire universe. $800 every 2 weeks, sent home to Manila, another $600 for her sister Maricel's chemotherapy treatments, leaving barely enough for rent and the cheapest meals she could survive on. The double shifts had started as voluntary overtime, extra hours to build a financial cushion against unexpected disasters, but somewhere along the way they had transformed from choice to necessity to inescapable trap. She pulled up photos on her cracked phone screen with trembling fingers, showing him images of a laughing girl with Rosa's same bright eyes, but thinner now, her head wrapped in a colorful scarf that could not quite hide the toll that illness had taken. Behind Maricel stood their mother, aged beyond her years, her smile brave but exhausted, and Dr. Chen recognized the expression of someone watching their child suffer while pretending strength they no longer possessed. "The complaint started small," Rosa continued, her words picking up momentum as if a dam had finally cracked, releasing waters too long contained behind walls of silence and fear. "A patient who refused her care because of her accent, requesting only American nurses as if geography determined competence or compassion. Staff members who somehow never heard when she asked for assistance, leaving her to lift immobile patients alone until her back screamed in protest, and her shoulders developed knots that never fully released. The charge nurse who assigned her the most difficult cases with the most demanding families, watching with barely concealed satisfaction when Rosa emerged from rooms with tears threatening to spill, but never quite falling. She had written it all down, every incident carefully documented with dates and times and witness names, composing formal complaints that followed proper hospital protocol exactly as the employee handbook instructed. Dr. Chen's expression darkened as Rosa retrieved a folder from her bag, worn at the edges from being carried but never opened in any official capacity, containing a dozen letters addressed to human resources that had never made the journey from her locker to their intended destination. Each one represented a moment when she had almost found courage, almost believed that the system designed to protect employees might actually function as promised, but then reality would intervene with its harsh mathematics. A submitted complaint meant investigation, investigation meant attention, attention meant risk, and risk meant potential job loss that would cascade into visa cancellation and deportation back to a country where her sister's treatment would immediately cease for lack of funds. "I wrote them to feel like I was doing something," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I could never actually send them because doing nothing felt safer than doing the right thing." The consultation room's fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent song above them as Dr. Chen carefully read through Rosa's documentation, his jaw tightening with each new page. And when he finally looked up, Rosa saw something in his eyes that she had not encountered in months. Of silent suffering, a fury directed not at her weakness, but at the system that had weaponized her vulnerability, and a determination that suggested her silence might finally be ending, whether she was ready or not. The photographs glowed on the cracked screen, like windows into another world, one where Rosa existed as sister and daughter, rather than invisible laborer whose pain went unacknowledged by those who should have protected her. Dr. Chen leaned forward as she swiped through images with fingers that trembled slightly, revealing a small, concrete house with bright blue paint peeling under Manila's unforgiving sun. Laundry hanging like colorful flags across a tiny balcony, potted, plants crowding every available surface because her mother believed growing things brought hope even when circumstances suggested otherwise. Then came the photos of Maricel, and Dr. Chen felt his throat tighten at the transformation visible across chronological progression. A vibrant teenager in earlier pictures, dancing at a school festival with arms raised towards sky, gradually diminishing into the fragile girl with hollow cheeks and brave smile who dominated recent images. Her bright scarf wrapped expertly to hide what chemotherapy had stolen, but could not disguise the exhaustion that lived permanently in her eyes now. "She wants to be a nurse like me," Rosa whispered, her voice breaking on words that carried the weight of dreams that might never materialize if the mathematics of survival shifted even slightly against them. Before she got sick, she was top of her class in science, always studying anatomy books I sent home, asking me questions about procedures and medications until I had to research answers because she was so curious about everything. "The treatment was working," Rosa explained, her words tumbling faster as if speaking quickly might prevent the fragile reality from shattering. "But the cancer center required payment before each chemotherapy session, and missed appointments meant disease progression that could transform manageable illness into terminal diagnosis within weeks." Her mother had sold jewelry, borrowed from neighbors, exhausted every possible resource until Rosa's remittances became the single thread keeping her sister tethered to life, and that thread felt increasingly frayed with each passing day of accumulated abuse and threatened employment. Dr. Chen watched Rosa's face as she described the careful budgeting that governed every decision, how she calculated exactly which meals she could skip without compromising her ability to function during 16-hour shifts, which bus routes saved precious dollars, even when they added exhausting hours to commutes that already stole what little rest she could claim. She showed him text messages from her mother, carefully worded to avoid adding guilt, but transparent in their desperation. Maricel asking when Rosa might visit, not understanding that the cost of a plane ticket represented 2 chemotherapy sessions her sister could not survive without. I tell myself if I can just endure a little longer, save a little more, maybe I can build enough cushion to breathe again, Rosa said, finally looking up from the phone screen to meet Dr. Chen's gaze directly, her eyes reflecting years of accumulated exhaustion and determination that refused to break despite impossible circumstances. The consultation room felt smaller now, compressed by the weight of Rosa's reality, laid bare between them, and Dr. Chen understood with complete clarity that the assault he had witnessed in the corridor was not isolated incident, but inevitable result of a system that taught vulnerable workers their suffering mattered less than institutional convenience, their silence more valuable than their dignity or safety. He closed the folder of unsubmitted complaints with careful deliberation, his decision crystallizing into something solid and immovable. And when he spoke, his voice carried the certainty of someone who had just drawn a line that could not be uncrossed regardless of consequences that might follow. The documentation began in stolen moments between surgeries. Dr. Chen filling leather notebooks with timestamps and detailed accounts that transformed invisible suffering into undeniable evidence, requiring institutional response rather than continued willful blindness. He interviewed nurses during their brief lunch breaks in his private office, watching exhaustion and relief war across their faces as they finally spoke truths they had buried beneath professional smiles and desperate need for employment that paid better than anything available in their home countries. Maria from the cardiac unit described a physician who routinely berated her accent in front of patients until she developed such severe anxiety that words tangled in her throat before emerging. James, working nights in pediatrics, recounted being assigned the most dangerous cases involving violent patients, while documentation mysteriously failed to record his complaints about inadequate security support that left him nursing bruises he photographed secretly in bathroom mirrors. The patterns emerged with devastating clarity as Dr. Chen cross-referenced incident reports against staffing records, discovering complaints that disappeared into administrative black holes, while the same nurses received disciplinary warnings for minor infractions that their colleagues committed without consequence. He photographed the discrepancies with methodical precision, building an archive that revealed institutional rot extending far deeper than individual prejudice, showing instead a carefully maintained system that exploited vulnerability while punishing those who dared challenge arrangements that benefited from their silence. His reputation as the hospital's most decorated surgeon granted access to files and meetings that others could not penetrate, and he wielded that privilege now with surgical precision, extracting evidence from databases and email chains that administrators assumed remained safely buried beneath layers of bureaucratic obfuscation. The formal complaint he drafted stretched across 27 pages, each paragraph supported by documentation that transformed deniability into impossibility, naming specific incidents and systemic failures that demanded investigation rather than the quiet settlements and non-disclosure agreements that had previously contained similar situations. Dr. Chen's hands remained steady as he added his signature to the bottom of the final page, understanding completely that this action represented professional suicide in slow motion, that powerful people would unite against the threat he now posed to comfortable arrangements that protected profitable relationships over human dignity. He submitted the complaint on a Thursday morning, walking it personally to the hospital's human resources director and the regional medical board, refusing to allow the documentation to vanish into convenient administrative limbo, where uncomfortable truths traditionally disappeared without trace. The lawsuit papers arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by a courier whose apologetic expression suggested he understood the weight of the envelope he carried. Thick, cream paper embossed with the letterhead of Morrison, Sterling and Wade, the kind of law firm that charged more per hour than Rosa earned in a week. Dr. Chen read the document in his office while rain streaked the windows, each paragraph a calculated assault, threatening defamation claims, interference with patient care, and damages exceeding $2 million, naming both him and Rosa as defendants in language designed to terrify rather than merely inform. The wealthy family had weaponized their connections with ruthless efficiency, transforming Rosa's humiliation into legal ammunition that could destroy her visa status and bury Dr. Chen's career beneath litigation that would drain resources and reputation simultaneously, regardless of eventual outcome. Hospital Administrator Patricia Thornton appeared at his door within an hour of the lawsuit's delivery, her perfectly tailored suit and practiced smile barely concealing the threat she carried. Like a concealed weapon beneath diplomatic language, she settled into the chair, across from his desk, with calculated grace, arranging papers that documented his brilliant surgical career while speaking in tones honeyed with false concern about protecting his legacy from this unfortunate situation that could be resolved so simply if he demonstrated reasonable judgment now. The promotion to chief of surgery sat between them, like poisoned fruit, accompanied by a substantial salary increase and the private assurance that his complaint would be investigated quietly, discreetly, in ways that wouldn't embarrass the institution or powerful families whose donations funded research wings and state-of-the-art equipment that saved countless lives. Dr. Chen watched her performance with the detached clinical assessment he usually reserved for complex diagnoses, recognizing the choreography of institutional self-preservation that valued reputation over justice, comfort over change. She spoke of Rosa with manufactured sympathy, suggesting the poor girl would be better served by keeping her head down and focusing on the family, depending on her income, rather than pursuing complaints that would only paint targets on her back for future retaliation that the hospital, regrettably, could not prevent. The unspoken threat hung in the air between them like surgical smoke, the implication that Rosa's visa status remained perpetually vulnerable to administrative complications that could emerge from continued cooperation with investigations that embarrassed powerful people accustomed to operating without consequence. The silence stretched after Thornton finished speaking, broken only by rain against glass and the distant sound of hospital announcements echoing through corridors where nurses like Rosa continued working through abuse that institutions preferred to ignore. Dr. Chen thought of the leather notebooks filled with testimonies, the photographs of bruises and discriminatory schedules, the faces of immigrant workers who had finally trusted someone with truths they had carried alone for so long, and he recognized this moment as the crossroads where comfort diverged permanently from conscience, where he would choose either complicity disguised as pragmatism or resistance that would cost everything he had spent decades building. Rosa appeared at Dr. Chen's office that evening, like a ghost materializing from exhaustion, her scrubs wrinkled from a double shift that had stretched. Her body and spirit beyond sustainable limits, dark circles beneath eyes that had witnessed too much suffering in corridors where compassion should have lived, but cruelty had made its home instead. She carried an envelope that trembled in her hands, official Department of Homeland Security letterhead visible through the translucent paper, and when she spoke, her voice fractured into pieces that scattered across his desk like broken glass reflecting fluorescent light. "Please, Dr. Chen, I'm begging you, stop defending me," she whispered, each word costing her something precious, pride dissolving into desperate pragmatism born from circumstances that allowed no room for dignity when survival demanded sacrifice. The deportation notice inside threatened removal proceedings based on complaints filed by the wealthy family, allegations of professional misconduct that her visa status could not withstand, legal language that transformed her presence in America from documented to disposable, with bureaucratic efficiency that acknowledged no humanity beneath its stamps and signatures. She placed her phone on his desk with shaking hands, screen illuminated with messages from Manila that carried devastation across oceans in digital text. Her mother's words describing how her sister Maria had collapsed during treatment, how the cancer had spread despite therapies Rosa's remittances had funded through months of enduring abuse that now seemed meaningless against mortality's advance. Photographs showed a young woman whose smile Rosa remembered from childhood, now hollowed by illness. Hospital beds in Manila that lacked the equipment surrounding them in Chicago. Doctors who required payment before procedures that might offer hope, but demanded resources Rosa could only provide by remaining employed regardless of cost to herself. "She has maybe 3 months without the new treatment," Rosa said, tears tracking down cheeks she no longer bothered wiping. Mathematics of survival reducing her choices to impossible equations where dignity became expendable luxury she could not afford. "If I lose my job, if they deport me, she dies. Do you understand? My silence is the price of my sister's life." Dr. Chen felt the weight of her words settle in his chest like stones, recognizing the impossible moral calculus that systems of power imposed on the vulnerable, forcing choices between justice and survival that should never exist in civilized societies claiming to value human dignity. He saw in her face the accumulated trauma of months spent swallowing abuse, the systematic grinding down of spirit that institutions enabled through willful blindness, and understood that his privilege allowed him options, her precarious status denied, his citizenship a shield she did not, possess, his resources a buffer against consequences that would destroy her completely. "They're using your family as weapons," he said quietly, recognizing the calculated cruelty of threatening deportation to silence testimony, understanding how power perpetuated itself by isolating victims and making examples of those who dared speak truth to institutional corruption. Rosa stood to leave, shoulders carrying burdens no single person should bear alone, her surrender to injustice born not from cowardice, but from love that prioritized a sister's survival over personal dignity, maternal obligation, transcending self-preservation in ways that revealed both the beauty and tragedy of her impossible situation. "Thank you for trying," she whispered at his doorway, gratitude mixed with grief for battles she could not afford to fight, and Dr. Chen watched her disappear into hospital corridors where other nurses continued their shifts, wondering how many more carried similar stories of silent suffering beneath professional smiles that institutions preferred not to examine too closely. Dr. Chen sat in the darkness of his office long after Rosa departed, city lights beyond his window casting geometric shadows across walls that seemed to close around him like the narrowing margins of moral choice. And in that silence, where hospital sounds faded to whispers, he made a decision that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of everything he had carefully built through decades of professional caution. He reached for his phone with hands steadier than his racing heart suggested possible, scrolling through contacts until he found Sarah Martinez, an investigative journalist whose exposés on healthcare inequity had earned both Pulitzer nominations, and powerful enemies who preferred institutional failures remain buried beneath public relations statements and legal settlements that purchased silence. "Sarah, I have a story that needs telling," he said when she answered, voice carrying conviction that surprised him with its certainty, and he began describing Rosa's situation with the clinical precision of a surgeon identifying disease that required radical intervention rather than palliative care that merely masked symptoms while corruption continued metastasizing through institutional structures. His second call went to his wife Jennifer, a civil rights attorney whose practice specialized in defending vulnerable populations against systems designed to intimidate them into submission through bureaucratic complexity and threat of consequences that transformed justice into luxury only the privileged could afford. She listened without interruption as he outlined Rosa's deportation threat, the hospital administration's complicity, the wealthy families' connections that formed protective networks around abusive behavior. And when he finished, she responded with the calm determination he had loved since their first meeting at a medical ethics conference 15 years earlier. "I'll file an emergency motion to halt the deportation proceedings first thing tomorrow morning," Jennifer said. Legal strategies already forming in her mind like chess moves, anticipating opposition's tactics. "And we'll need documentation of every incident Rosa can remember, statements from other nurses, anything that establishes a pattern of institutional discrimination and retaliation against whistleblowers." Dr. Chen spent the remainder of that night transforming his observations into evidence, compiling incident reports he had quietly documented over recent weeks, cross-referencing staff schedules with complaint patterns that revealed suspicious correlations between certain administrators and dismissed allegations against connected families. His investigation uncovered what he had suspected, but feared confirming that Richard Thornton, a hospital board member whose pharmaceutical company donations funded entire wings, was uncle to the man who had threatened Rosa, and that previous complaints against family members had mysteriously vanished from official records, while nurses who filed them transferred to different departments or quietly resigned under circumstances suggesting coerced departures rather than voluntary career changes. The evidence painted a portrait of systematic corruption more extensive than individual cruelty, revealing how institutional power protected itself through networks of influence that transformed hospitals from healing spaces into hierarchies, where vulnerability became liability and speaking truth invited destruction. And Dr. Chen understood that exposing this reality would cost him dearly, but remaining silent would cost him something more precious than reputation. It would cost him the person he had always believed himself to be when comfortable illusions no longer provided shelter. From moral clarity demanding action regardless of personal consequence. The story broke on a Tuesday morning when Sarah Martinez's article appeared across digital platforms with a headline that transformed private suffering into public reckoning. And within hours, the hospital found itself besieged by reporters whose cameras captured the building's pristine facade while exposing the institutional rot festering behind its walls of manufactured professionalism. Dr. Chen arrived to find his credentials suspended, security escort waiting to accompany him from premises he had navigated freely for 15 years. But the humiliation he anticipated never materialized, because Rosa stood in the main lobby surrounded by 24 nurses in scrubs of every color, their presence forming a human barrier between him and the administrators who had expected quiet compliance rather than collective resistance that transformed individual vulnerability into unified strength that could not be dismissed or intimidated into silence. "We stand with Dr. Chen," Rosa announced to the gathering media, her voice no longer trembling with the fear that had characterized their first encounter, but resonant with conviction earned through discovering she was not alone in her suffering, that her story had given permission for others to speak truths they had buried beneath survival's necessities. Nurse after nurse stepped forward with testimonies that painted devastating patterns. The Haitian nurse told to go back where she came from by a patient's son, while supervisors ignored her complaint. The Indian nurse whose credentials were constantly questioned despite decades of experience. The Mexican nurse who endured ethnic slurs, disguised as jokes that management dismissed as harmless banter, unworthy of formal investigation. Their voices wove together into chorus of evidence that could not be explained away as isolated incidents or misunderstandings, revealing instead a culture that had normalized cruelty and protected perpetrators while punishing those who dared name injustice occurring in plain sight. The hospital's carefully crafted response crumbled as investigators arrived demanding records that administrators suddenly could not locate. As Richard Thornton's connection to Rosa's attacker spread across social media platforms where public outrage built with viral momentum that transformed local incident into national conversation about healthcare hierarchies and immigrant exploitation. Dr. Chen watched the institution he had served begin its reckoning, understanding that his suspension was tactical retreat by leadership hoping to contain damage. But Rosa's courage had ignited something beyond their control, a movement that would not be satisfied with individual accountability, but demanded systematic transformation that addressed root causes, rather than superficial corrections designed to restore public image while preserving power structures unchanged. In the chaos of that transformative day, as cameras captured nurses who had found their voices and administrators who had lost their carefully maintained narratives, Dr. Chen felt the weight of consequence settling around him like inevitable weather, yet within that burden resided strange liberation. The freedom that comes from choosing integrity over comfort, from recognizing that some costs are worth bearing because the alternative is becoming complicit in systems that destroy human dignity while hiding behind institutional respectability that functions as permission for cruelty, disguised as professional standards. 6 months had transformed the hospital from fortress of silence into architecture of accountability, and Dr. Chen stood in the modest clinic he had opened 3 blocks from the medical center where his career had been suspended, then quietly reinstated after investigators documented patterns too damaging to ignore or minimize through institutional deflection. The space smelled of fresh paint and possibility, its waiting room designed specifically for healthcare workers who had spent careers caring for others while their own needs went unaddressed, immigrants who worked healing into exhausted bodies while systems extracted their labor without offering protection or dignity in return. Rosa moved through the clinic with authority that would have seemed impossible during their first encounter, her white coat bearing the title head nurse embroidered in navy thread, her movements carrying confidence born not from erasing trauma, but from transforming it into purpose that served others still trapped in cycles she had escaped. Through the window, Dr. Chen could see the skyline that had witnessed their battle, the city indifferent to individual suffering, yet somehow responsive when enough voices joined together to demand that indifference give way to justice that required more than words, but structural change, reflecting stated values rather than convenient performance. "Your sister arrives next week?" Dr. Chen asked, reviewing the schedule that showed Rosa had requested 3 days off, the first vacation she had allowed herself since beginning work in this country that had promised opportunity while delivering exploitation dressed in professional language. Rosa's face illuminated with joy, unmarked by the fear that had characterized every expression during those dark months when speaking truth meant risking everything she had sacrificed years to build. "She's in remission, and the visa came through faster than expected," Rosa replied, her voice carrying wonder at outcomes that had seemed impossible when she stood begging not to be kicked by someone who saw her as less than human, disposable labor without dignity, deserving protection. The photographs she now showed depicted a sister smiling with health restored, a family reunited not through silence that preserved cruelty, but through courage that had cost everything yet somehow returned more than what was lost through standing firm. When surrender seemed the only option, survival offered. The clinic had become sanctuary for 17 nurses who had left positions where abuse was normalized, their presence testament to rippling consequences of one doctor choosing intervention over comfortable indifference when witnessing injustice that others had learned to unsee. Richard Thornton had resigned from the hospital board amid investigations revealing years of protected misconduct, his departure creating space for policies that transformed complaint procedures from protective theater into genuine accountability. Mechanisms that believed victims rather than automatically defending institutional reputation. Dr. Chen understood their victory was partial, that other hospitals still harbored similar toxicity, that systematic change required continued pressure rather than celebration of isolated progress. Yet standing in this clinic, surrounded by nurses who had reclaimed their voices, felt like revolution measured in individual dignities restored, in families reunited, in courage that had metastasized from one woman's trembling plea into movement that refused to accept cruelty as the cost of survival in systems designed to extract rather than honor the humanity of those keeping them functioning. Rosa placed her hand briefly on Dr. Chen's shoulder, a gesture of gratitude, but also solidarity, recognition that transformation required allies willing to risk comfort for justice, that individual courage multiplied when witnesses chose intervention over the passive complicity that allows institutional cruelty to flourish unchallenged in spaces, claiming to heal. Outside, the city continued its indifferent rhythm, but within these walls existed proof that sometimes standing firm against injustice creates cracks in systems that seemed immovable, that speaking truth despite devastating personal cost can ignite changes rippling far beyond individual circumstances into structural transformations, reflecting the values institutions claim, but rarely practice when doing so, requires sacrifice rather than merely comfortable proclamation of principles that cost nothing to announce yet everything to actually defend when consequences arrive demanding more than words. Would you have found the courage to speak up like Rosa did when everything was at stake? Subscribe to hear more stories that reveal the power of standing firm when silence seems safer.